Hey guys, it's Mr. Antoon here. We're going to be doing Civil Rights Part 2 today. Let me go ahead and share the presentation for you. Hopefully you watched this prior to to showing up in class that day. So here we go. Civil Rights Part 2. This should be done on Wednesday or Thursday for you, April 8th or 9th. We're talking about civil rights and minorities, how to protect those groups. Again, in class, we're going to go through all of these cartoons. This is a really good one to show you how the minorities have a disadvantage. Again, college admissions, affirmative actions based on race, and then sports. So we're going to talk about those a little later. Okay, so make sure you have those. There's a lot to get out, or a lot to get out of those. Now, this is a handout that you'll get online. You don't have to fill this out. I think you actually have this in your packet. You can if you want. All the answers will come from here, and you should know the basics of these groups and how they were protected for equal opportunity. Okay, the 14th Amendment with that equal opportunity. The last day of presentations will be today. I want to review a few of them. You should have all but 4 completed on that list. Marbury versus Madison was judicial review. McCulloch, Maryland was you can't tax a federal institution. That was more of the hierarchy of who is the supreme law of the land. And then let's go over U.S. Lopez and McDonald Chicago right now to cover it. So with U.S. Lopez was 1995. A 12th grade student in San Antonio carried a firearm into school. The next day, the state charges were dismissed after federal agents charged him with violating a federal criminal statute, the Gun-Free Zone Act of 1990. So it's a federal law that trumps a state law. Okay, the act forbade any individual knowing to possess a firearm at a place that he or she knows is a school zone. Lopez was found guilty following a bench trial and sentenced to 6 months in prison and 2 years supervised release. So here's the question the justice had to ask. Is the 1990 Gun-Free Zone Act forbidding individuals from knowingly carrying a gun into a school unconstitutional because it exceeds the power of Congress to legislate under the Commerce Clause? So the big question here was that Congress made this law and used the Commerce Clause as a result for the Gun-Free Zone School Act. So the question is 9 justice ruled. Pause it, and if you want to research or do whatever you can. But again, it came down that it was a yes, and it was very a tough decision to rule on it. 5-4. Yes, the possession of a gun in a high school zone is not an economic activity through repetition elsewhere have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. So it has no connection, the law, with the Commerce Clause. So they ruled Congress's law unconstitutional. So that's kind of what happened in this case here, guys. So again, the Supreme Court checked the legislative branch, or the judicial branch checked the legislative branch. And you could see the ruling, a bitterly divided ruling at 5-4. The next one is McDonald versus Chicago. This is about the Second Amendment. Several lawsuits were filed against Chicago and Oak Park in Illinois challenging gun bans after the Supreme Court issued its opinion in a former case called District of Columbia versus Heller. In that case, the Supreme Court held the District of Columbia handgun ban violated the Second Amendment. Therefore, the court reasoned that the laws in question was enacted under the authority of the federal government, thus the Second Amendment was applicable. Here, the plaintiffs argue that the Second Amendment should apply to the states. So DC, kind of a federal area. The district court dismissed the suits. On appeal, the U.S. Court of Appeals affirmed that, and it went to the Supreme Court. So can Chicago, Oak Park in Illinois, ban guns? That's kind of what happened at this time. So the question they had to answer was, does the Second Amendment apply to the states because it's incorporated by the 14th Amendment, which is privileges and immunities or due process clause, and thereby made applicable to the states? So again, pause if you want or guess. The answer is yes, 5-4 again. And again, you can read why in that whole thing. But again, it's now for the first time ever, the Second Amendment was incorporated to the states. So selective incorporation comes into play here, guys. All right, let's get going on. Now, with your handout that you're going to have in front of you that you should fill out, you'll see the little red slide where I'll show you what to fill out. But let me give you some background to it. So African Americans and their civil rights. There's about 15% of the U.S. population, and the discrimination they went through as a group is slavery and then voting rights. So you could see where they live in the southeast, kind of the south, and then you could see a lot of moved into not a lot, but again, you could see the Midwest, even in the Southern California region as well. So slavery is a big issue for them. 1808, the slave trade was stopped. 1865, you outlaw slavery. There's no more slaves allowed. They're now free people. But Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws kept them down, meaning they kept being discriminated during that time. The KKK rose after 1865, focusing on whites first, so white supremacy here. You could see Plessy versus Ferguson reinforced that separate but equal was a situation there. And again, Plessy was 1/8 white, or 1/8. I always forget this one. But anyways, he was not allowed in the train car with all the whites because he had a portion of him that was African American. Segregation laws in America was mainly the South. It looks like the Civil War again being set up. A segregation is required prior to 1954. We have to give everyone equal opportunity and equal education. So the first major Supreme Court case was actually in higher education. In Sweatt versus Painter, he sued to go to the UT Law School and won, but he'd already finished. So they consider that both law schools, the one at Texas State today and the one at UT, were not equal. So therefore, he won the case. And then elementary school and secondary, Brown v. Board, probably the biggest case of all time. It ended segregation in all public schools all over the nation. Okay. Voting rights was another one for them. And you could see again, voting, the issue was voting rights acts in certain states. To this day, we've had literacy tests, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, the white primary only, meaning no minorities can run for office. The 24th Amendment got rid of poll tax. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 ensured that minorities had more of a right to vote going forward. But even to this day, there is voter suppression going on. It's in lower, poor regions of America, there are not as many places, polling stations to go and vote. So they'd have to trek or wait in lines for 2 or 3 hours to vote, which would make them feel like, okay, the process is not for me, my vote doesn't count, and then disenfranchise their vote, meaning they're just not going to vote because it's not easy for them to vote. So there's some issues that are still going on with them. And you can see with this cartoon how hard it is to actually get to vote here. They're making fun of that with voter ID laws. This is where voter ID comes into play here. You can see strict photo in Texas, we're one of them. In California, there was no voter ID law. You didn't need to show your ID. You just had to walk in with your registration and you would vote. So it's a little easier in certain states that are liberal, more so than the conservative states. Again, you can pause here and answer this question if you want. Supreme Court has the right to overturn all of the following except for which one? Pause, pause, pause. The answer is they can't touch the Bill of Rights, okay? So you're going to fill out this portion on your handout. This is the kind of where you see the red slide, or at least the red box. We have to ensure African Americans get equal access to education, prohibit discrimination, and ensure they have voting rights. And then you can look at the pathway and then even the outcome to major cases with them to reinforce that group of African Americans are protected to some degree. All right, the next one is Hispanic Americans. This is the largest minority group. They have 16% of the population. Southwest is more so for them, the South and Southwest, and Hernandez versus Texas was their major case. You can see where they reside, okay? And the issue with them was immigration, especially illegal immigrants. Children of illegal immigrants can attend public schools, even though they're not paying taxes for the most part. There's no consensus on national policies, whereas Trump is putting them in cages. When they come over the border here, he wants to get rid of part of the 14th Amendment, which is to the naturalization, or when a child is born in America, he wants to get rid of that to ensure that what he calls good people coming to America, because he feels that most immigrants are not good, especially from the South or from Mexico. So again, there's some of the issues that are going on with that. You can see here the total U.S. population bar. We're about 330 million now, and you can see the number of illegal immigrants based on the year is right around 11 million. Per year that come in here, and they don't pay taxes, but they get a lot of the benefits living in a certain area. But a lot of people say, should we, have them all become immigrants right away, or citizens right away, or should we continue to be strict on allowing people to come into our country? You can see illegal alien removals based on president. In this case, Barack Obama did have a lot. People think he did not. Trump's probably going to be higher than this, but because this only goes to 2013 in terms of that. The states with the most unauthorized immigrants, you could see Texas is in there at 6% or 6.3, where Nevada has the highest. The U.S. overall has 3.5%. And for them, Hispanic Americans is the largest group. And you can see, again, it's very similar. Go ahead and pause this if you're going to write this out, guys. I'm just giving you some help and walking you through this. Asian Americans, the fastest growing minority group. You could see, again, they reside in the West, Northwest, kind of the coming from the Asian countries or the Asian continent. The Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s, and then the Japanese Americans were interned during World War II, during 1944. You can see where they reside. They also reside in the Northeast. You can see Hawaii and Alaska have them as well. In 1869, when our two transcontinental railroad, when our trains met in Utah, they took this photo, and there's not one Asian person in this photo, which shows the discrimination because they're the ones who were really involved on building that railroad for our country. So it kind of shows you how we discriminate or segregate as a result of that. It's still 1869. And then Japanese internment camps where they were kept. I know they're smiling here, guys. It wasn't forced labor. They just were quarantining them during the war, interning them until the war ended. So we didn't have any issues from within our country to fight back for the Japanese. In terms of population growth, you can see Asian Americans at the highest. I always have fun with NHPI, which is the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and then AIAN is an interesting one. It's American Indian and Alaska Native. So you can see if that's from 2000 to 2010, Asian Americans have the highest and fastest growing population. And again, for them, you can see some of the stuff that's involved for them. They are the fastest growing group. So go ahead and pause the video if you need to write those, if you're writing those at all. I'm going to skip the video. Native Americans, these are the oldest minority group. They've been here before we were. In Manifest Destiny, we took most of their land. They've had a history of poverty and discrimination where they were forced to live on reservations. But those reservations, we kind of apologized and said, you can be semi-autonomous. You don't have to pay a state tax if there's a state tax on that reservation. You could see where they were. This is just American Indian, Eskimo, and Aleutian persons. But you could see some of the reservations. This is from 2000, I think. And again, their pathway to advance equal opportunity would be basic civil rights, prohibit discrimination, and economic development. Helping them with their reservations by allowing them to have casinos is a big one. You can see the gambling enterprises through state laws. So it's a big one for Native Americans. Middle Eastern Americans, this is the most feared minority because of 9/11. You can see how many exist. They're kind of in a lot of the, I know from living there in Los Angeles, there's a lot, but again, they're popping up everywhere in terms of where they live. They've been racially profiled, meaning automatically consider them a, if you're Middle Eastern, you consider, oh my God, they're part of 9/11, or you automatically consider them a terrorist. So we have to have evidence to prove that they're guilty before we racial profile. So that's kind of the whole idea with them. You can see a lot in the Northeast, in Florida, and in the Southwest as well. And you can see just how our feelings is about anybody who's a Middle Eastern who's considered Muslim. You can see, does Islam encourage followers towards violence? And in this case, upwards of 60% of Republicans believe in 2014 that it does encourage violence for Muslims, whereas independents and Democrats are a little lower than that. Again, overall, in the world, Catholic with Protestant is 45%, you could see. Again, and the Muslims are 24% of the world, but they are the fastest growing religion. Here are the mosques that are in America. California, New York, and Texas have the most. We do have the most populous, so it should be obvious there. And then their pathway for Middle Eastern Americans is to really stop the profiling. Everyone's really prohibited discrimination, but to stop racial profiling. And as a student at your age, back in 1988, I was trying to fill out all my college forms, and I was trying to not check the white because I wanted affirmative action. And I was checking other and putting in Lebanese or Middle Eastern Americans. And then based on my research, in 1906, I think it was, a Supreme Court case said anybody coming from the Middle East is considered part of the white category. And that's kind of the outcome there. So again, we're considered white. Women, this is the most populous of them. I know that Hispanics were the largest, but again, women are 51% of America. And it's always a fight politically over who gets the woman vote, because they're very impactful in terms of that. You could see with Trump results, white women, non-college graduates overwhelmingly voted for Trump at 62%. Again, you see the breakdown of these exit polls in 2016. And obviously it was the suffrage movement. Again, in 1848, they got together and they wanted to say, we have to get the right to vote. And it took 60 years later or 70 years later for the 19th Amendment to be passed. The Equal Rights Amendment has never passed. It's been defeated twice, even though it kind of passed with the 38th state, which would actually make it the 28th Amendment, but it's not been approved yet. We've had wage discrimination on women in sports, with Title IX stuff. We try to give equality. In the military, can they serve on the front lines or even be drafted? And now we have sexual harassment that goes on in the workplace. Again, you're just seeing some of the images come in that what I talked about in terms of ratifying. That's the Equal Rights Amendment there. And then women, the wage gap between men and women in the workplace as well as in sports as well. With the U.S. men's national soccer team versus the U.S. women's national soccer team, women win way more. I think they have 3 World Cups at this point, 4 Olympics. Men have nothing, but men get paid a lot more money. You can see here, just for friendlies, U.S. women's team gets $1,350 if they win the game. The men get $17,000 to win, $8,000 for a tie, and $5,000 for a loss. So is it fair here? This is just a big example of the women for that. They did, Luna did help them get an equal pay bump. They paid them women $31,000 for the 2019 World Cup that they won. Title IX is part of the 1972 U.S. Education Amendments, and it prohibited discrimination based on sports. So sports started to change, where you'd have to give equal scholarships for men and women in college sports. So this is why women's sports today are so much more prevalent, because they are equally given the opportunity to succeed like men are. Military service, combat roles on the front lines, that's kind of gone away. Women can now do it as long as they can pull a human, a man or a woman who's 250 pounds off the battlefield. That includes all their gear as well. So women can now serve on the front lines. You could see men, if they fail to register for the draft, it could give you serious consequences. Men who don't register by age 26 might not be able to get federal or state benefits. You might not get your taxes. You could see you'll get a draft card at 17 and a half or right around your 18th birthday, and then you just send it back in. It doesn't mean you're drafted. It means you're part of the selective service in case there is a draft. And now women are fighting to get equal with this so they can be drafted as well. Right now, only men can be drafted. And there's a draft card of what it looks like with your social security number here, your date of birth. You would just send back half of this saying you've been registered for that. And lastly would be stopping sexual harassment in the workplace. Again, this is a big thing. You can see goes back to 1990s, early 90s, when Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill for the Supreme Court. I showed you that, where she alleged that he sexually harassed her as the boss and she was not comfortable. He denied it. And again, it's a he said, she said situation. This is very dangerous anywhere you work. If you do something wrong, you could be accused of it and you could lose your job or lose time at work. So be very careful with this. But again, there's protections for women, but it still does happen to this day. Lastly, for women, you can see all the stuff that we have to give them equal opportunity and pathways as a group of gender-wise. Okay. In terms of other ones, there's older people, LGBT, and people with disabilities that we're going to talk about very, very quickly. So you can't, there's a thing called ageism where they can't tell me, Jeff, you're going to force you to retire at age 50. No, I get to retire when I want to. And if you fire me as a result of my age, I can sue. That's age discrimination that's going on. Social Security is an issue. And the aging population, they're around longer than they used to be 50, 60, 70 years ago, guys. So the old people are here. So what do we do at that point? Because they're now a burden to our society. As you can see, older people are living longer and somewhat are a burden if they're not working. So they're working a lot longer in life. And that's an issue that we have. In terms of anybody with disabilities, especially physical, we have to give them access to public accommodations. You can't have just a stair set. They have to have an elevator for someone to go up or ramps to go up. Again, this is based on the American Disability Act of 1990. It's a federal mandate. At Eanes Elementary, they did not have their school retrofitted with ramps, and they were sued until they had that done. You could be penalized and fined for this, as well as not receive any federal funding unless you got this fixed. And you can see here, again, we have to give equal access to anybody who's physically and mentally disabled to give them a fair chance. And lastly, with LGBT plus rights, this is a tough battle that's ongoing now. We know with Obergefell versus Hodges, same-sex marriage was passed in 2015. And then Trump, you can see the negative side of it where he banned transgenders in the military, bathroom bills, anything that's happening. It's now, this is the focal group to equal opportunity going on at this point. Okay? And lastly, for these three, I'm going to leave this at you guys, and I want to say thank you so much for paying attention. This was a little longer at 21 minutes. I will see you tomorrow in class or the next time in class. Take care.